Good morning, everyone. It's Phil Wade from Dalton Wade Real Estate Group, and we're broadcasting today from the Orlando office, and I'm joined with Lisa. She's holding the phone. Lisa's sitting next to her.
Hey.
Harriet, Fred, Maureen, Shika,
Hi.
Peggy, Leslie, and Ismar. So today we're going to talk about, and a lot of these trainings come out of, questions from agents during the week. So today we're going to talk about the appraisal contingency and the financing contingency, so that we kind of understand the difference and, kind of who benefits, potentially from that. So with everything we do as real estate agents, there's always two sides. We're working with a seller, so they have one set of interests, and then the other is we're working with a buyer, and they have another set of interests. So, as you might imagine, those interests don't always, they're not always the same, right? So they're different. So the appraisal contingency is when everybody agrees that if the house doesn't appraise out, potentially the buyer can then walk away, get his deposit back. So the appraisal contingency is very favorable for the buyer and not so favorable to the seller. Lisa?
Does it also stipulate that the seller can reduce the price if he chooses?
Yeah, so there's a negotiation that goes on potentially afterwards between the buyer and seller or the agents, where again they can reduce the price to the appraisal amount, or and we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit, the buyer can just put more money in. So just because the house didn't appraise out doesn't mean that he can't buy the house. They just, so if they're doing, say, 10% down, they're a conventional loan, and the purchase price is $200,000, the bank mortgage company is going to give $180,000. So now it appraises out at, say, $190,000. They're only going to lend 90% of the $190,000, so there's a $10,000 difference. So the buyer has to come up with $9,000. The bank will, so the $10,000 difference, $9,000 was coming from the bank, and $1,000 was coming from the buyer. So now the buyer has to contribute that $9,000 in order. So they just have to put more down in order for the deal to move forward. And again, if it appraises for more, then that doesn't work. So it's the lower, the bank lends the lower of the appraisal amount, or what the house actually is selling for. So they don't then get to put less in if it appraises for more. So that's how that piece works. So and then the finance, so that's the appraisal contingency, and then the financing contingency, and again it's exclusive of the appraisal contingency. So for some other reason they weren't able to get the loan, their credit score went down, from when they applied to. Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, I'd like to know, what if the buyers don't have the extra money for the down payment?
Well, if the buyers don't have the extra money for the down payment, in an appraisal contingency, they're out. I mean, they can't, then they can't buy the house, so the deal falls apart because they don't actually have the money to pay the extra. So then it can't move forward. Now,
yeah, sure. So should we mention that in the contract before, like what they want to do, or they can get out, or
yeah,
they can come up with
we'll talk about that in a bit. That's a good question. Please.
Yeah, is the seller able to maybe come up with another deal? Maybe they want to sell it so bad they may want to
Right, exactly.
renegotiate.
So, right, they could, they could split the difference. We always like to split the difference when we're negotiating. Everybody is sort of, the seller is giving the same, the buyer's giving the same. So that's a possibility. The seller can come all the way down. So, using that same example, now the house has to sell for $190,000. The other thing that can happen, the agents can contribute. So Maybe each agent, you know, the buyer comes up 4,000, the seller comes down 4,000, and then the two agents kick in 2,000, you know, 1,000 each. There's your 10,000, and the deal can, you know, the deal can still move forward. So, you know, there just becomes another round of negotiations, sometimes the sellers, you know, won't budge, and the buyer either has to walk away or come up with more money. So it's another kind of round of negotiations that, you know, kind of go through in terms of the appraisal contingency. So the financing contingency is a little bit more broad, so that for any reason, like the person doesn't get the loan, you know, they're able, as long as you notify the seller and the seller's agent before the financing contingency ends, they're able to get their money back. Now, once the financing, you know, and again, this is something we've had several trainings on, but sometimes people still miss it. So when you have that buyer that's getting a loan, if you look on, it's number 8 in the contract, it'll talk about, you know, 45 days is now the default. But then if you read on, it's 7 days before closing. So if your closing's in 30 days, then they have to have the fund, you know, they have to have the loan in place at day 23. So you just want to keep track of that date, because after day 23, if they don't get the loan, then they're not entitled to get their deposit back. So you, as the agent, lost their deposit, and they will be very unhappy, because it's all avoidable, right? You know that date, as long as you have, you know, you know that date, and then you know, you're in communication with their lender to sort of make sure that they're able to get the loan. Now, most lenders issue a formal, it's called a loan commitment. So it's a formal letter that they give that basically says they have the loan, except we need to verify their employment. There might be some conditions on there, and if they're easy conditions like verifying employment, the person's not going to lose, then everything is fine. But if it's something like, oh, we still need to get the appraisal, or, you know, something that's a little bit more involved, then you have to either do one of 3 things: ask for an extension of the financing so that they're protected further out, back out of the deal, cancel the contract so that they get their deposit back, or basically waive the financing contingency and kind of let them, then if they're not able to close, then they would lose their deposit. So that's a discussion you would want to have with your client. Like Leslie's very good at, like, being on top of those dates and kind of making sure that you know, they're getting, I mean, you have one now, right? That's
It's supposed to close on Monday, and it's been in the, we had to ask for an extension for 2 weeks ago, and everyone said it's okay, but I still don't have the HUD statement, so it's been just kind of back and forth. So had I not asked for that extension 2 weeks ago, she would have lost her deposit. It was $5,000. So it looks like it's going to close on Monday, though.
question.
Is it just a verbal
No.
extension you get? You have to have it in writing.
You have to have it in writing. Everything has to be in writing. So, you know, you're just getting that. And sometimes the seller won't give you the extension. I mean, like, again, this is why you want to have a lender that actually, like, delivers on time. So when you're putting the contract in, you're asking them, like, how many days do you need? Now, most lenders can do it in 30 days. So if somebody's, well, you know, if you think about it, like, you want your offer to get accepted, right? As, you know, you put that in, and, you know, so for the seller, if you're working with the seller, right, and somebody's asking for 45 days to close, most lenders can do it in 30. So as representing the seller, what you're doing is you're extending it all out, and then if it doesn't close, like if they can't get the loan, you've waited longer to and that's not so good for your seller. So there's always, like, you know, when you're working with a buyer, like, you have, you know, one set of concerns, and when you're working, you know, if you're the listing agent, it's a different set. So they're definitely, you know, not in line. So when you're working, you want that listing to close, I mean, that financing to happen quickly. And when you're working with a buyer, you want to have them working with a lender that can do it in 30 days, because then you can call up and say, hey, you know, this person's rock solid, call the lender, they've done a great job on the pre-approval, they can close in 30 days, and it just gives more confidence to get your offer accepted. Go ahead.
Besides the appraisal that may hold something up, what are other things that the loan may not go through?
Well, primarily it's, I mean, if you're through the inspection, but primarily related to the financing, that the person's pre-approval really wasn't done all that thoroughly. They only pulled one credit bureau's report, and then the other two, that person wouldn't qualify. So when they actually go to underwrite it, they pull all three, and then they use the one with the lowest, so that would be a problem. The person went out and bought a new car, and was kind of like on the bubble in terms of their credit score. So they were, you know, getting a FHA loan, they need to be 640. They did something during the time, you know, they first ran them, it approved them to when they have to close. And that flipped them into, I mean, we had one, was Lisa's deal a while back, where they closed, right? And then that afternoon, the client goes out and buys, you know, all new furniture. And then the lender didn't run her credit like they should have prior to
The day before the morning of closing.
The day before the closing. They ran it after she already closed. And then after she already closed, the furniture's on there, her credit score now, and then they started giving her a hard time to like return.
They tried to get her to return the furniture.
Yeah, return the furniture, you know, but it was their problem because, you know, they screwed up. So then their problem is now they can't sell that loan. So then they probably had to, like, you know, put it in their portfolio, or it's called scratch and dent. You know, somebody will buy it, but it won't be bought for 100% value. So they probably lost money on that deal, but they messed up. So, but if she would have went out and bought the furniture like 2 days before, she probably wouldn't have got the loan. So that's things like that, or, you know, or.
But she was specifically instructed not to go buy the furniture. And she's like, Lisa, I did what you told me to do. I waited. So she did. So you just tell them. And
yeah, like when they're in that mortgage application
someone here had a
process.
buyer lose their job 3 days before closing. That'll do it.
Right, because they, you know, so again, you know, some people, and a good lender, you know, will tell you if, you know, oh, like if you have a relationship with them, oh, this person is tight, meaning, you know, like if it's got high taxes or like a high CDD. Hey, Jason.
Oh,
Put the camera on Jason. You're live, man.
it's morning.
All right. So we're just chatting a little bit about the financing and appraisal contingency. So as a buyer's agent, the financing contingency is something that you need to be all over. And that because again, like if like the contingency, it expires. And then basically at that point, your client is a cash buyer. And if they can't get the cash from the bank, then they don't get their deposit back. So if that falls through and, you know, it's you didn't really do what you should have done. You're protecting their deposit. I mean, and making sure, because it's all avoidable. You know the date, and unfortunately what happens is the people that are a little bit more shaky in their financings are the ones that take longer to get approved, right? Because there's something in their file that's causing, you know, the underwriter to have to do more work, or they're trying to fix something, or, you know, maybe do some quick credit repair to get them up a couple, and then, so those are the ones that, you know, when they can't sort of close on time, you know, you kind of end up worrying that in the end it's going to be a problem. So we just, you know, again, and it's just communicating with your client. Here are our options. First, let's ask for an extension, right? Hopefully the seller will give you that. I mean, we have one now with another agent. I mean, we've extended this thing like 4 times for a month, but the seller's good. They keep, and it closed yesterday. So a lot of times the sellers will give you the extension. Sometimes, like, they may have a backup cash offer, for instance, behind you, and as soon as you ask, they're not going to give you that extension. So, you know, again, that's why it's important to work with a lender that can deliver, you know, basically basically on time. So just getting back a little bit to, the appraisal contingency. So if you're the buyer's agent, the appraisal contingency is, to your buyer's advantage. But if you are putting an offer in with an appraisal contingency, it's a weaker offer, because basically it gives that buyer an out if it doesn't appraise. If I'm the listing agent, I'm telling my client, we need to make that go away. I mean, I just had, where I'm the listing agent, they put in appraisal contingency, I just told them, like, no, we're not doing that, find another house, and it went away. So it's not favorable to your seller at all, because here's a true story. House is listed at $279, full price offer, appraisal comes in at $249. The seller said, and he didn't have an appraisal contingency, and so now he can't buy the house because he doesn't have the extra funds. But he still wants the house. So he, like a week later, applies with another lender. A new appraisal 3 weeks later. 3 weeks, so not much time, $289. One person, $249. The other person, appraisal, both licensed appraisers, $40,000, they valued that house different. So it's subjective. So, why, it's not, they're not God appraisers. It's just one person's opinion, and often that opinion isn't correct. So, or at least can be off. So if you're working, with a seller, and that offer comes in and it has an appraisal contingency, you really want to try to get that out of there, because all it can do for your seller is lower the price. I mean, they're not, potentially. I had another one where, and we knew the price was high. It was like 700, and I can't quite remember, 745,000, and but they're putting half down, right? And they're getting a loan for like whatever it was, 375, something like that. And then the appraisal comes in at 710, so it was like 35,000 under. And then they're like, oh, you have to lower the price. I'm like, we don't have an appraisal contingency, and obviously you have you have the money, right? So they just had to put, they borrowed less and they had to put a little more cash into it, because whether it was 375 or they still had the cash they were contributing. So that ended up going away and it closed. But so the appraisal contingency is very favorable to the buyer and not so favorable to the seller. So and then again, and then just quickly to talk about like VA and FHA. So with VA and FHA, when you fill out the addendum, so there's the VA FHA addendum as part of the contract, there's an automatic appraisal contingency built in there. So if they're FHA or VA, it's automatic. If your seller signs up an FHA or VA buyer, that appraisal contingency is just part of the deal. If it's conventional, then it's optional.
What about USDA?
USDA, I would have to get back to you, and I'm not 100% sure on that.
That needs an appraisal.
That needs an appraisal,
Yep.
so that needs an appraisal.
And then there is a rehab loan.
The 203K loan,
Yeah.
Yeah, that would-
Same.
right, that, because it's FHA, so that's an FHA loan, it has the appraisal contingency in there.
No, I'm talking about the rehab loan.
The 203K.
They're not all 203K. They're rehab loans that aren't FHA.
Like if the buyer wants to work on the property.
But borrow the money from the lender.
Yeah.
If there's a conventional product, then there's no requirement that it has an appraisal contingency. Just if it's an FHA, or VA product, HUD, then it has the appraisal. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Why they have that is because the person is putting so little down. Like VA is 0 down, FHA is 3.5% down. So if it doesn't appraise, the bank's already sort of in the hole.
Is there a loophole with the new conventional that's 1% down and then the lender puts the other 2 and it's not payback?
I don't think it's so much a loophole, it's just that there's not an automatic appraisal contingency. I mean, with conventional, it's optional, meaning like if you put it in as the buyer's agent, you can do that, and then if the seller is willing to agree to that, then, you know, your buyer has that in there. Again, as a listing agent, I'm working really hard never to have that in there, like especially today. And again, you know, a lot of this I think, you know, came out of like some of the training going on at Aura, where they're telling newer agents like you should be putting in an appraisal contingency on all your transactions. Now that was happening like years back when the market was going down. But when the market's going up, like it's hard to buy a house as it is, right? So, you know, two identical offers, same price, everything's the same, except one has an appraisal contingency and the other doesn't. The seller isn't like, it's a no-brainer. They're accepting that other offer, right? Because, so it's basically, you've weakened their offer. So again, just educating your buyer and I mean, if you can get it in there, go
And
ahead.
when you are dealing with a lower priced home and somebody's not putting 50% down, then chances are they aren't going to get financing. So you can, most of the time, except in an example like Phil, the one that Phil gave, you know, your client does have an out with the financing contingency, right?
Well, they do and they don't. I mean, technically, if they have the money to make it up, they're supposed to do that, right? If you know, if there's the appraisal came in short, right? Say that 10,000 again, and now they need to kick in the 9,000. If they have the 9,000, they're supposed to do that. If they don't have the 9,000, then they can't do that. Then they wouldn't be able to get the loan. So it's, and again, you know, whenever you're working again as the listing agent. You know, when somebody's backing out on you, you know, you want to see like why they got denied, because a lot of lenders will just do the denial letter, even though it's more like, oh, the person now doesn't, like we had one where and we were representing the buyer, so, you know, we were fine with it, and the listing agent accepted it, but like they basically just decided they didn't want to buy the house anymore after they were out of the inspection period. They could have got the loan, and then the lender gave them a denial letter and they got out, you know. So if you get the denial letter, you gotta, you know, just make sure it's legitimate, that they really can't buy the house, okay?
Are you able here to contest an appraisal if you're able to find comps that support the higher price?
Yeah, you can definitely do that. You can try. It's highly unlikely you'll be successful. Here's why. That appraiser, I mean, they take a lot of pride in what they do. They're professionals, right? And if they start changing their comps and their work, you know, then every time something didn't appraise, they would be disputing it, contesting it, and so they vary. I mean, we had one this week. I mean, she gave them some really good, you know, comps other than what he used. It got denied. So it's really hard, you know. I mean, I personally never. I mean, it's rare, very rare, that you can get it overturned.
It's happened once that we know of in all of you.
Like hundreds of, you know, it just. I mean, probably not 100 that haven't appraised, but it's hard because, again, like that's. I mean, if you think about it, and it kind of defeats the purpose of the appraisal, right? If every time, you know, it didn't appraise, it got disputed and overturned, well, why even do the appraisal, right?
I've done it
Yeah.
6 times. 3 times I was successful, and 3 times I was
Awesome.
not.
Yeah. So you can do that. I mean, so we just haven't had the greatest experience in terms of getting it overturned. I mean, you got to really find some good comps. And again, you know, if you think about it, like when that person went into that deal, those comps should have been, right? You should have already known that.
So what if the buyer doesn't have the extra cash in a conventional loan? Will he lose his deposit?
Not if there's an appraisal contingency.
What if there's not?
If there's not,
And they genuinely don't have the money?
as long as you've canceled the contract before the financing contingency expired, they get their money back. It's only, you know, that's why the financing contingency date is so important, and why we have had umpteen trainings on it, but it still seems that, so, I mean, I had it this week, you know, the agent's calling me and she's saying, oh, you know, it's gonna delay, and I'm like, okay, did you get the extension on, you know, when, you know, and it was like 3 days before it was supposed to close, did you get the extension on the financing? No, like, and, you know, so they just, again, like, they don't, you know, that's the inspection contingency and the financing contingency. As a buyer's agent, you have to be all over those dates. I mean, just, this is no more complicated than that. And if you're not, and you know, the person on the financing, you know, again, they're just, you know, they're gonna just, I mean, lose their deposit. So, and that's terrible.
Mhm.
Why could there be such a discrepancy in an appraisal, in one appraisal, like the one that you gave? That was a question.
Because it was a fairly, you know, dense area. It just was what the appraiser picked. One appraiser picked these 3 houses, and then that other appraiser picked 3 different houses. I think sometimes, again, you know, when they, again, you know, I'm not an appraiser, so I don't know, but I mean, I think sometimes, like some of them, you know, when it's a purchase, a sale of a home, they know they know the number. Like, they have the purchase and, you know, the contract. So they know what they need to get to, right? Some of them, I don't know, like Lisa, you had the one where the guy like misses the bathroom, right?
Oh, I had one where the guy, he knew before he went to the house he wasn't going to appraise it. I mean, he told me on the phone. He's kind of like, you know, this is priced high, and then I get there and I meet him, and he says, this house across the street sold for, you know, 127, and this one's 145, and I'm like, look at the house across the street. It's a mobile home. This is a block home. And he didn't even go. He walked straight through the house, did his measurements outside, missed an entire half bath. It wasn't in his appraisal. He didn't appraise that house. He knew what he was doing. He told me he was Mensa. I was trying to make his job harder. He comped it. This was a brick-lined street with beautiful trees, and he comped it to two of his 3 comps were on a very busy street, 10 blocks away, in a very different neighborhood.
A lot of times they don't know what they're doing. I mean, are they, you know, I mean, you know, they're not in those other houses. They may, you know, they may not know that, like, you know, in a lot of places, you go a few streets, it changes, right? And if they're, you know, those houses sold for less, they use one of those, you know. Sometimes we had another one where, you know, the house was, you know, starting to move into the not so nice, you know, neighborhood. The guy uses comps from the, you know, like 2-3 streets over where it's better, but then he adjusts it like 70 grand. So he uses 3 comps, right? He comes up, and then right off the top on each 70 off because of where this house, you know, so it didn't appraise by 30,000. Now, could he have said 40,000 off and it appraised? Maybe, but he didn't do that. So it's,
And we've had him go the other way,
Yeah,
where we were certain they weren't going to appraise. We knew the areas, this is crazy, and then it appraises.
yeah, like we had a house, I remember, you know, it took a while to sell, and then like one weekend, you know, we hadn't gotten any offers, and all of a sudden, bang, 4 offers. So there was a bidding war, and then, you know, the appraiser's not from the area. He took the comps from, you know, where it was
3 blocks away.
Yeah, the right 3 blocks away, and then it all worked, you know, and we're like this. So, you know, it's very subjective is what the bottom line is, and it's just one person's opinion, and that's, you know, proven out by 1-249, 1-289. It's just, you know, so that's why, again, if you're working with a seller and they want the appraisal contingency, like, I just tell them, it's like, you're the real, like, you know, because you're dealing with the other agent, you know, I mean, hopefully you did the comps. You're not having your client, like, grossly overpay. But then, you know, now you want us to be subjected to one person. No, like, go find another house type of thing, you know what I mean? Because it's just, you know, and again, these folks, they had the money, they have the extra money, so if it comes up a little bit light, they just have to pay me. Nobody wants to do that, you know, everybody wants to kind of feel, oh, I'm in a house where, you know, like, I'm not starting in the hole, but, so they're two separate things, the appraisal contingency, and the financing contingency, so, you know, the appraisal contingency can be helpful for the buyer. A good listing agent probably is not, you know, advising their client to accept that offer, because it's very subjective to just that, and then, you know, all it can do for the seller is ultimately have to go through another round of negotiations, potentially have to lower the price that they're getting, or have that buyer walk away on them after, you know, 3-4 weeks into it.
Juan had a $25K difference between appraisals on one house also, but question, are you required to share the appraisal with the seller?
If it doesn't appraise.
What if it does?
No. I mean, you could, but you don't have to. I mean, it's just the buyers, you know, I mean, basically you would tell them it appraised out, we're good. And again, like sometimes, like, you know, here's another one that's sort of like, how do you, some buyer's agents, they'll like meet the appraiser, and then they'll give the appraiser the comps, like that they want him to use, like they're helping him. Now sometimes, like I don't do that because I'm always afraid, then I'm like telling the guy what to do, and you know, they might not like that.
But is that legal? Can you do
Yeah.
that? Oh, you can.
Yeah, you can do that. I just try to, like, if they call me, I get back to them, I'm really nice to them, you know, I'm doing everything.
And if they
I can.
ask you for comps, and sometimes they will ask you.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
yeah.
For
Sometimes
help.
if it's a hard appraisal, like in, you know, they'll ask you, like, you know, because the other thing we see that's sometimes problematic, is that, you know, the house is listed for 200, and then, the offer is 205 with 5,000 closing cost credit, right? So they kind of give them a full price offer, but they rolled in their closing costs. And then the appraisal comes back and it's 200. Because, you know, then like they're saying, well, you priced it at 200. So sometimes if you're going over the list price, you know, it gets harder to get the thing to appraise. But again, you never know until you really have that appraisal come in. Alrighty, any other, everybody have a little better understanding of those two concepts? They're gonna make sure they don't lose their buyer's deposits. Any further questions?
Mm-mm. Yes, those are pretty key items you need to keep up with.
You have to keep on top of that, exactly. Anybody?
What if the
embarrassed
appraiser asks if there's anything, you know, that he should know? Should you tell him what the asking price, what should?
Well, they'll have that. I mean, they go through the MLS, they have the contract. They usually don't ask questions like that. They're pretty, most of their work is done kind of behind the scenes. I mean, they do go to the house, they do, you know, measure the rooms, they do take photos, but primarily, you know, they're doing all their research, you know, kind of in their office. And a lot of times, you know, they'll have done the research, like in Lisa's case, like he had done the research before. A lot of times they do the research first, and then they kind of go to the house just to sort of, but where it gets tricky is when, you know, it's all been redone, and then none of the other houses in the area, you know, I just find most of them are willing, you know, if they can get there, they will. They're not there to sort of, you know, but they do have to sort of find the comps and
Juan's kind of letting
yeah.
us know that it might be helpful to tell him some of the updates that they might not be able to see from looking at some of those other comps. You know, the roof is new, the AC is new. They can see that stuff if they take the time to look when they get out there. Electric's been updated, plumbing, blah, blah, blah. Things they can't see.
Yeah, I mean, they're in and out of that house pretty
Quickly.
Right.
Unless they're FHA, then they tend to, if they're doing their job, they stay longer.
Yeah, so FHA, we can just touch upon, and VA, so not only do they do the appraisal, but then they also do sort of an inspection for certain items, and then those items all have to pass. And if they don't pass, then they put it in their report, and then those have to be fixed prior to the closing. So again, you don't want to put your buyer in an FHA, VA buyer in a house where those, potential issues you've already spotted. It's okay to do that, provided you've talked to the listing agent or the seller, and they're willing to fix those things if they do come up, because. If
What
they're
are
not-
those things?
Those things are, the roof has to be greater than 3 years old. There
Life
can-
left in it.
Life left in it. No wood rot, no chipping paint, no cracked flooring, no broken windows. Those are the main ones that you can kind of pick up on.
Window or an exhaust in the
Who
bathroom.
is responsible, seller or buyer, to fix those things?
So,
Well, yeah,
for VA, the seller has to fix everything.
For,
VA and F, I mean, they have, basically what happens is it comes on their report, and then if the seller's not willing to fix it, the deal is gonna fall apart, because, they can't get the loan, because what has to happen is, there's a reinspection. So again, your buyer has to pay a couple $100 more for the appraiser to come back out, and then re-inspect that everything's been.
There's a dollar amount that you put in the addendum that says the seller is gonna fix items up to this amount. So if those items are at or under that amount, they have to fix them.
Right. So, but again, like when you're trying to get your offer accepted, usually, hopefully you've looked at the house, there isn't much, so usually you'll put 0 or 500. If there seems like there's something, you might put 2,000, and hopefully that kind of covers it. But again, the seller, just like with the appraisal contingency, they've agreed that if the repairs do get called out, they'll spend this much, they've agreed in advance to do that. Any other questions in Periscope land? Any questions from anybody? Alrighty, thanks so much, and we'll be back next week with another good topic. Cool. Thank you. So we're going to try to make these monthly.